мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
We are under attack. It is an attack against Western democracies and on the institutions that bind them.
What Russia's much more interested in doing is depicting the West as a failure.
The regime and President Yanukovych, they were trying to protect their enormous wealth.
This is Kremlin File.
So it's all good. Okay, everybody, welcome to Kremlin File. Julia Davis, we have Julia Davis with us. Hi, Julia.
Hi, so good to be with you. I'm honored to be invited.
No, we're honored. Okay,
Exactly.
I know. I mean, I've been following your Russian media monitor that you can find on YouTube, everybody. So hop on there and go and look at all the clips.
On Twitter too, until
on Twitter, yeah.
Elon, whatever that sociopath
Exactly.
started silencing everyone. But
exactly. Yeah. So I've been following everything that you're producing, and I'd like to actually start off with a question that I think you probably get everywhere, but I think I really need to ask it because I watch these clips. And, I'm reading the subtitles. Sometimes I watch them 2 or 3 times just to see if I've actually understood, what this is it kind of thing. I'm having conniptions the whole time. The ideas are insulting and they're just absolutely crazy, especially towards Ukrainians, also the West. But let's put that aside especially with you. Julie, how do you do it? How do you do this every single day?
I do it as a collecting evidence. So I try to be as cool and calm about it and think about what matters, what's important for the Western societies to see that they probably didn't realize about Russia, and also what I hope will someday be played at their trials in Hague, because it's so atrocious what's happening, and they're also quite open about it. So that's how I approach it, and that's the only way to really maintain a cool head about it, because as you said, it is completely outrageous and very hard to stomach when you understand that they're not only saying these things, but they're actually doing them, and people are dying.
Yeah. You also presented evidence, if I'm not mistaken, not long ago. Was it at the UN with all of the material that you had gathered?
The Professor Timothy Snyder had referenced my work at the UN when the Russian ambassador in Nebenzia pretended like he didn't know what was being said and complained about this terrible Russophobia and claimed that there were no genocidal statements made in the Russian state media, which of course you have seen just through what I put out alone, that it happens, and not only regularly, but it's a basically constant drumbeat. Certainly they leave it to their mouthpieces to say, not the Putin himself or his spokespeople, but his mouthpieces are just as much as a part of the regime's bullhorn as anybody else, because nothing is being said there without being first sanctioned by the Kremlins or their handlers related to the Kremlin.
No, it definitely is difficult to stomach. And I mean, this is something that goes back to the Soviet Union, goes back to the Tsars. I mean, propaganda is definitely what Russia exceeds at. Julia, let's start with the propaganda in regards to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. For a decade, Russia's propaganda ran like a well-oiled machine. I also, grew up with listening to this garbage, and normally everyone was on the same page. But when Russia started suffering humiliating losses on the front lines in Ukraine, you suddenly saw a crack. And this started happening about pretty much exactly a year ago in August. especially as Ukraine was gearing up for their successful counteroffensive. You started seeing a crack and, and seeing like outrage and critique towards Russia's, defense ministry and even like the Kremlin. And it was something that you really have never seen so much before. Can you discuss how it changed?
Yes, it was quite remarkable when you could actually see some criticism taking place, especially when they started their mobilization and people were complaining. And then when their troops didn't have the ammo, didn't have what they needed, because obviously, as we've all seen, they were prepared for this quick 3-day thing. Some actually estimated that it would only take hours to take Kiev. So they were utterly unprepared for the scale of the war this had become, even though the West had repeatedly warned them, don't do it, don't do it. But they thought it would be just like Crimea. It would be very light sanctions and it would end very quickly. So when it didn't, it caught them off guard. And that's when it was so interesting to see even most loyal mouthpieces voicing criticism, although they have gotten it under control pretty well since then. And they had actually commented that now without Prigozhin, with his recordings, when he was still alive, they were saying, oh, now that this felon is not constantly recording his videos, look how nice everything is. No one is complaining anymore. They have everything they need, which of course they're not complaining for other reasons. They're trying to stay out of trouble and stay alive. But they actually made those statements. And there's still a lot of inconsistencies when something happens. I like to capture their very first reaction before they've received their notes as to what the official line is supposed to be. Then it could really show what they're really thinking. So it could be quite interesting. Right now with Robotine, what is happening in Robotine, they at first they had claimed this is such an important spot, we're keeping it, and now with the Ukrainian troops advancing, all of a sudden they're saying, oh, who cares about it? It's just a little spit on the map, it doesn't mean anything. So, and things like that are changing very rapidly. But there again, I don't see any criticism anymore, and especially with Prigozhin's death, it really seemed to have sent shockwaves through the ranks of propagandists, because they're a lot more nervous than before. And they all, not that it surprised anyone, I mean, they all said right after the mutiny that the only way out of it for Prigozhin and Utkin would be a bullet to their head. In other words, they were going to get them no matter what. But it serves as yet another reminder that no matter how useful they are to Putin's regime, if there is any reason whatsoever that he suspects their disloyalty, or if they're no longer needed, they could be done away with just as quickly, just like turning off the light. So it really was the equivalent of a cold shower, and they're acting a lot more nervous and subdued right now.
Okay.
And
Julia, with this, go ahead.
And to follow up, the propaganda for Russia's genocide began with denazification. Despite, since 2014, Russia has actual neo-Nazi paramilitary groups fighting in Ukraine. Then it shifted over to the war on the West and NATO, and that this is, a bigger fight. Can you discuss how the propaganda has changed and where is it now? Because, I mean, as of, today, Russia still calls it a special military operation. 18 months into this, over 100,000, I believe, dead. Where is it now? What is their excuses for, committing genocide in Ukraine?
Yes, as you pointed out, they started with this ludicrous claim of denazification, even though some of the people like the co-founder of Wagner himself, Utkin, is covered in Nazi tattoos, and obviously he's a Nazi himself. And so is Melchakov, who was decapitating puppies on air with a Nazi flag, and he was the one also participating in what they have stirred up in 2014 in eastern Ukraine. So it was preposterous from the start, and it didn't stick. It was obvious that people there were scratching their heads as to what to make of it, because of course they have their own pretty prominent nationalist elements there. So it never made much sense, especially since the Nazis themselves were supposedly carrying out this denazification. So they've started to amend this story. Another one became that they're doing this for God, and they're having a hard time where Jewish Solovyov is yelling Allahu Akbar on air to appeal to their Chechen fighters and other Muslim fighters they have there. In the same breath, they're claiming to be the troops fighting for Jesus. They're basically throwing it like spaghetti on the wall just to see what sticks. And their ultimate agenda is to appeal to whatever they can appeal to in anybody. The angle with supposedly doing this for God is that they're fighting the West that is trying to turn them all gay and is pushing the liberal agenda down their throats. So this is what they're still sticking with. So almost every time they're talking about it, they will bring up something related to LGBT and claiming that someone was coming to change their way of life, and that's really why they're there. But inevitably, the truth constantly surfaces when they mention Ukraine's resources, its minerals, its people, which Russia has such problems with its demographic. And they were talking about, look at this, we're getting all these people for free. How great it is. Our demographic problem will be solved. And also about all these new lands they're going to get. And it's obviously all about that. It has nothing to do with liberating or saving anybody. Even RT's Margarita Simonyan had admitted it on air on state TV, saying, well, if they're freezing like they were hoping that people would freeze in winter with cutting off electricity, she said it's okay, because once they take over, then the ones that are with them, they will warm them up and feed them then. But for now, it's just what it takes. What are you going to do? And now the main theme is that when they call it war, the reason their top propagandists get away with calling it war is because they're doing it in context of it being war against NATO and the West as a whole, supposedly to preserve their freedoms, which of course no one was encroaching upon, and it's just really a sick joke at this point. But this is all presented as them fighting NATO, and they're telling their people that they are actually fighting NATO armies and military capabilities, which is certainly not true. But they have zero respect for their viewers, so it doesn't matter if they tell a news story the next day from what they said the day before. They expect them to just roll with it, and unfortunately a large percentage of them do.
In fact, you've opened a few doors here, Julia, of different things that we want to get into. Well, first of all, just note everyone that Julia's been watching and having to monitor all this stuff. When did you start, Julia? Like, you were already talking about the war in 2014.
Yes, around the time that the Ukraine's Revolution of Dignity started, and then Crimea was annexed. So since the end of 2013, the beginning of 2014.
Yeah, with your reference. I wanted to get to it's a basic question, but I think it would help our audience to understand certain things about Russian media in general. Which of the narratives, it's a two-part question. So which of the narratives are really meant for domestic audiences, okay, Russians who are actually watching, right? And which of this, the propaganda is really meant for like Western audiences, right? This is the first one. And then who is it that actually decides on the propaganda itself, that has to, let's say you're saying that they can switch. One night it's this, then something happens, and they say the complete opposite thing. For example, one of the clips that you have on your YouTube channel is exactly that. I remember listening to one and then they just flipped, right, the day after. So who actually decides? So these two questions.
They have their handlers, which send these talking points to all of their main media networks, which all of them are state controlled. There is no independent media left in Russia, effectively. It's all been uprooted. So they are sent these notes, and they have meetings. They receive this lineup of what the topics that they're supposed to focus on and the way that they're supposed to present it, and that is exactly what they do. And like I said, it doesn't matter that it changes quite drastically. And the other part of your question, who is it directed at? It's directed in equal parts to their domestic audience and also Western audiences. For example, they get very excited when Western media repeats their nuclear threats. And in the beginning of the war, it was done very credulously, where people actually were concerned, but they did themselves a disservice. They said it so often and they said it so flippantly that I think most media organizations and most people in the West now understand that it's meant as nothing else other than a deterrent for our continued help to Ukraine. And these threats are quite hollow. And so that part is certainly directed at the West. Also, when they talk about how much the West is losing because of its support to Ukraine, how its own people suffer in equal parts. It's supposed to appeal to the domestic population who is, they're complaining about their rising prices, about difficulties because of sanctions. That makes them think, well, don't worry, those poor people in the West, they really suffer even worse than this. But really, they're hoping that it will be picked up and disseminated there. And also, don't forget about the Russian speakers that are living abroad that are also expected to grab onto this message and spread it there locally, which is part of their strategy. And there are a lot of Russian speakers in the US, for example, that have their own YouTube channels that are not curtailed in any way because they're just supposedly expressing their opinion. Like the same blogger who was on January the 6th at the Capitol, saying that they were there just like their grandparents stormed Berlin on tanks. Here they are to storm the Capitol.
Hi, everybody. If you enjoyed this podcast and you'd like to help us out with our independent work, please subscribe to Kremlin File on Substack and on our YouTube channel. Kremlin File is hosted by Olga Lautman and me, Monique Camara. Our production team is headed by Maddie Kaparov, and the theme music by Oreste Camarra. So please don't forget to visit our Kremlin File Substack for links to our socials and to wherever you'd like to listen to podcasts.